I'm Rebecca Challoner, and this is the Good People Podcast.
It's a tip of the cap, it's a pat on the back, it's a smile from ear to ear. They're the good people from round here.
Yes, welcome to another episode of the Good People Podcast. Today I'm joined by Rebecca Challoner, who is the founder of My Spirited Child. She's an ADHD advocate. She runs some amazing conferences. She's an award winner. She speaks on some of the biggest stages and shows to talk about her work in the ADHD field. Rebecca, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, you were saying before that you're a very busy person, so I'm thankful that you made time for us today. Thank you so much. You've got a lot of conferences going on at the moment.
Yes, lots of conferences. Well, they're always going on, so they go on throughout the whole year all over the country.
Right across Australia, yeah. So WA, South Australia coming up.
Yep.
Then also, where do you do? Victoria?
Victoria we've just done in the end of April.
Yeah.
And then we've got New South Wales, Tasmania, both coming later in the year as well. And then we have Northern Territory, North Queensland, sort of beginning and end of the year, beginning of next year.
Yep.
As well. I'm not sure if I've missed any states, but yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and I said WA. Yeah, so pretty much the whole country.
That's fantastic. And so, and what we're going to do, we'll talk about those conferences as well. And we also want to touch on, you're a winner of a Oz Mumpreneur Award.
Yes. Yeah.
2020.
Yes.
And then you got a 2022, you got the silver as well. So that's nice.
Yeah, that's lovely.
And also you're a lawyer.
Well, yeah, I have a law degree.
Yeah.
I got that back in the UK before I moved here. But yeah, it's not really my passion. My passion is sort of neurodivergent conditions and the disability field.
Yeah, and you also got a bunch of other other qualifications in psychology and.
Yeah, I have diplomas in psychology, sociology, history, a couple of sciences.
Yep.
IT. Yeah, I think that's about it.
And all this has set you up to tell the world all about ADHD and why it's so important that we look after the children and give them the best education. So maybe what we'll do, because I mean your conferences, you've got thousands coming to some, right? Like the Melbourne Melbourne was recently. How big was Melbourne?
Yeah, I think Melbourne had about 850.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was pretty decent size. It's not our biggest, but it's what up there, one of the biggest.
Yep. And what would be the biggest one that you do?
WA.
Yeah. And that's how many would that be?
Last year we had about 2,000 at WA.
Yeah. And is that one day? It's a one-day conference?
Yeah.
And in that you have keynote speakers and what else do you do there?
Yeah, so we have a range of expert speakers from all over the country, sometimes different places in the world. And then we have a load of exhibitors as well who are there with their services and products that support people with ADHD. So people get to listen to the speakers and then during the breaks they get to have a look at the exhibitors and see if they can find services that help themselves.
Yes. What I want to do though is I want to go backwards. I want to go back and talk about what were your reasons for wanting to start this. So maybe do you want to tell us a bit about I guess your journey with ADHD? It's got a lot of parts to it. So
I started in this field, I guess, a long time ago when I was about 21, teaching children who are neurodivergent. Had a little class of 12 neurodivergent children, and that really is what sparked the passion. But at the time I didn't know that I was ADHD, and I didn't have my son yet, and then when I gave birth to my son when I was 26, and he was neurodivergent, and that really sort of pushed that passion. And then I did a lot of work in the field, a lot of volunteering and things like that over the years, did my qualifications, which just reinforced it some more, then found out I was ADHD. But essentially, when I started My Spirited Child 8 years ago, the biggest thing for me as a parent was that we parents don't get much support, especially around ADHD, but other neurodivergent conditions as well. And I was so sick of there being no information, no support. And I thought, well, if I can't find it, I'll just create it. And so I built the website, which was just full of articles on different things to try and get that information out there. And then from there it grew, and we started the conferences, and then we started creating sort of resources and guides and brochures and all these, just anything we could think of that would help push that information. Because a lot of the time for parents and educators and professionals, and for ADHDers themselves, a lot of the time all they're missing is someone to tell them, the information that they need, the strategies that they need, and then they'd be okay. We just kind of, we get the diagnosis, and then we're a little bit lost, and we're a little bit left to our own devices. So I sort of just wanted to give people that.
Yeah, and that's even if you get the diagnosis in the first place. Like, it's a low percentage of people getting the diagnosis, right?
Yeah, so especially here in Australia, I often actually hear from people who think that ADHD is overdiagnosed. ADHD in Australia is actually significantly underdiagnosed.
Right.
So ADHD here is about 5% of children are diagnosed with ADHD. Well, compared to the rest of the developed world, that's exceedingly low. In America, they're closer to 10%. So we're quite behind the eight ball there. And in adults, it's half again. It's closer to sort of 2.5%. So we're really behind in terms of that diagnosis here. And so there's a lot of people who are sort of left not knowing what's going on. And
yeah. And what was the tell for you? What made you think, I've got ADHD?
Oh, I think I always knew. I'm very stereotypically ADHD,
Right.
so I think I always knew, and I've known most of my life. And when I actually eventually got round to getting diagnosed, all my friends who had known since school all said the same thing, and they were like, oh, of course, they just couldn't believe it took me that long to get diagnosed. But, like any ADHD, it took me a long time to get round to it.
Yeah, sure. And it's genetic too, obviously. So it followed down, and you say, reflecting, you think that there's relatives of yours that you would identify as well.
Yeah, so 82% of the time ADHD runs in families. So in my family, I have ADHD, my kids have ADHD, my mom has ADHD. And looking back at my nan, who's not around anymore, but we used to say that she had a grasshopper mind. Right. And obviously she had ADHD as well. So we are definitely clearly in that 82% that it just runs a really firm line straight through the family.
And by grasshopper mind, you mean sort of always jumping around? Is
always. So she would just jump from one topic to another, from one conversation to another, and was always, could never stay on topic, could never stay on track.
Yeah. And the other thing that is interesting, I think, about neurodivergence in general is it's often people who have it tend to be attracted to hanging out with other people who have it. So you end up grouping together. So I'm hearing quite a lot of families who are both the partners and the kids and even relatives are all happening. And that's your situation too, right?
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people, a lot of ADHD is you grow up feeling a little bit out of place and just feeling like you don't always quite fit in. I know I really struggled with always feeling like I was a bit too immature for a lot of people. And so when you find other people who you fit with and who are also neurodivergent, you feel at home and you feel comfortable and you don't feel judged, which is such an unusual thing for many ADHDers because we've felt that a lot throughout our lives. So it would obviously be natural that we'd sort of gravitate towards people who are also neurodivergent.
Yeah. And do you think people are suppressing their real personalities a little bit with by having it because of being judged? Or
100%. A lot of kids especially go through school and they put up these masks. It's very, very well known in girls. So girls are even more underdiagnosed than boys because they mask to try and sort of get through. And that's not to say boys don't as well. A lot of boys mask as well because they find that way they can sort of hide in the background and won't sort of risk so much judgment and so much, I guess, being sort of exposed to things.
And that affects their the way they grow up. It affects their education. it affects all these sort of things, right? Like it has a big impact on how they get to their professions and those sort of things.
Oh, everything. I mean, I'm the perfect example of that. I came out of school, I failed school completely. I came out with
Really?
nothing. I was always in the bottom groups, treated like I was not very bright, never got an award, never achieved anything in school. And it was because for me, it was the easiest thing to do to get through school was to sit in the background and pretend that I wasn't there. And if I couldn't follow the teacher's instructions, because obviously I had ADHD and I was distracted, rather than putting my hand up and saying, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, because ADHDs don't like to do that, I would just pretend I did, but I just would pretend I knew what I was doing. So I'd hand in work and it would just always be wrong because I didn't hear the instructions. And so the teachers would just assume that I couldn't do it. In actual fact, if I knew what I had to do, I could have done it just fine. And it had nothing to do with intelligence or ability or anything like that. And so, later on in life, when I went back to college and back to university, I came out of it and I did okay. And now, now I have 2 companies and a law degree and I'm fine. But if you were to tell any of my teachers back then that I was going to end up like I am now, I think they'd have probably fell over in shock.
Off the seat.
Yeah.
I've reflected on my school reports. I've said in other episodes before, one of the comments that resonates with me now but also annoys me is that the one that says, it said, Andrew can do whatever he likes as long as he puts his mind to it. And I think about that, okay, well, maybe it wasn't that I wasn't trying to put my mind to it. Maybe I just wasn't in the right environment to put my mind to it. So I think we're possibly leaving behind a lot of amazing brains as well.
Loads. Yeah. I mean, some of the most successful people in the world are ADHD.
Yeah.
If you look at ADHD and autism, for example, I reckon probably 9 out of the 10 richest people in the world are one or both, and I know the list of really famous, really successful ADHDers is really long. And the reason for that is because ADHD brains are phenomenal. They're phenomenal brains. But school doesn't always fit for a lot of ADHDers because in schools, unfortunately, there's a little box that you have to sort of fit into, whereas ADHDers don't fit into that box. And what we sort of need to happen with the education system is rather than trying to fit all kids into a box, it needs to start trying to fit the box to all kids and going the opposite way.
Yeah. And do you have any ideas how to do that? I mean, that's a big question.
Yeah, well, I went on a TV show in the States last year, and one of the things that was about was how to reinvent the education system. And I have to say, it's very hard, but because the biggest problem with the education system is it's never moved. The problems that I had 40 years ago, 35, 40 years ago at school, the things that made me fail and the reason I failed school, my 11-year-old, who's just like me, is experiencing the exact same things now. So here we are across the other side of the world, 40 years later, and the education system hasn't changed. And I always hear from people in the education system, especially people quite high up in the education system, telling me it has changed, and they tell me all these things. But a lot of the things, unfortunately, are too superficial. It needs changing at its core. It needs reinventing, and that's a very large task.
It is a big task because we haven't really changed a lot in a long time. So it's very, for want of a better word, institutionalized. The same classroom environment, the same setup, the teacher, the kids facing forward, all the things. And I had a great guest, Dr. Loz from Science Play Kids, who was openly autistic and ADHD. And she was talking about her own experiences, and she needed to touch and feel things and do things in different ways to learn. The standard rote learning or the standard sit there and watch just did not work for her, she was saying. And so perhaps that is sort of the first step, is introducing new ways of teaching the same, tactile or something. And
yeah, I mean, there's so many things that need to happen to the education system. And for ADHD specifically, one of the biggest things is much deeper than just education, is we need to, as a whole entire civilization, as a whole community, we need to start accepting and understanding ADHD better so that in schools it can be better accommodated for. Because right now, there's little to no accommodations in schools that are made for ADHDers.
Yep. And also, like, even just things like break times and what they do in it, and the instructions for their breaks and stuff to remind them to go to the toilet and things like that, where they, because I've heard that that's a thing as well. You sort of don't realise you need to go to the toilet, and all of a sudden you do, and then teachers think they're being disruptive, and so they get put in the naughty box. And
it's quite horrific, some of the things that happen to ADHDers in the classroom, which they really can't help. I went to my son's parent-teacher interview recently. Yeah. He's got a new teacher this year. And I was so upset by it. I didn't even prolong it. I kind of left as soon as I could, because one of the first things he said to me is, if only Jesse would just sit still and pay attention. And I said, well, he's got ADHD. And he said, yes, but I don't mean in an ADHD way. I mean in terms of, if his friends are there or he's paying attention to them. I said, again, still ADHD. You don't pick and choose what distracts you and what doesn't. Yeah. He needs support, not just, you just sit still and listen, which is ridiculous. You wouldn't say to someone in a wheelchair, just get up and walk, because it's inconvenient for me to push you, and there is, I occasionally go and do a professional development in a school, and they're brilliant. I've done some, and the schools are so responsive and they really want to do things to help. But unfortunately, there's so many schools, and the system in general doesn't want to help.
Yeah, they need the support as well, right? Because they have to reinvent how they do things.
Yeah,
so
completely.
You can't. So you need support behind that you can't just change the way the classroom is taught without that support, right?
And the problem is they don't get the system isn't in place to help ADHDers.
Yeah.
To put those accommodations into place a lot of the time.
Yeah. Is there any big ones, do you think, that are easy short-term ones, or is it just a systematic?
Oh, there's loads. There's loads of little things that teachers can do themselves. For example, turn the fluorescent lighting off. If you don't need it, if you've got windows, turn it off, because fluorescent lighting is a massive trigger for many neurodivergent people.
Is that right?
Yeah.
What does it do?
It's a sensory processing thing. So a lot of ADHDers and autistic people and children have really big sensory processing challenges, which means things like fluorescent lighting can really heighten their anxiety. Things like carpet time, when you've got a bunch of kids sat on the floor next to each other, if somebody with ADHD sat there trying to pay attention and someone next to them's got their leg bouncing up and down, touching them, or someone behind them's talking to them, they're just not going to be able to pay attention. So they really need, to sort of think about things like that. Things like, if they've got, if they're very touch sensory, so tactile sensory, is it a little girl? Have they got their hair tied up in a ponytail? Because that will really trigger them as well. Are the labels in their uniform irritating them? That will trigger them. One of the simplest things that I tell teachers to do is, when they're giving instructions, chances are the ADHD kid didn't hear those instructions. And our teachers often say, but I write it on the board. Well, they're underestimating the power of distractibility in an ADHD, because from looking at the board to looking back at their work, they've already been distracted and they've forgotten what it said.
Yep.
So just simple things like writing the instructions on a little piece of paper and putting it on their desk in front of them.
Yep.
And doing it for everybody, because you can't single out the ADHD. We have a bit of a fear of judgment, so you can't do that. But putting those instructions right in front of them, right at the top of their worksheet, so that they can see it and it's right there without them getting distracted. There's lots of these sort of tiny little things. Putting an elastic band around their chair legs so they can bounce their feet on, because ADHDers are able to concentrate better if they're moving.
Yeah.
So it's just tiny little things that teachers can do really, really easily.
Yep.
To help ADHDers.
Yeah. I used to think like fidget spinners and things, it would have been terribly annoying to have around, but now they're becoming a thing that's it's useful and okay.
Yeah, fidget spinners can be great, especially if they can find the silent ones. So I do a lot of work with a company called Kaiko Fidgets, who make a lot of the fidgets, and they have a lot of silent ones, and they're fantastic because then it's not, the noise doesn't distract others.
Yes.
Because they're quiet. And anything that's subtle, quiet, that, again, ADHDers really don't like the feeling of being judged.
Yep.
And so having something that doesn't draw attention to them is really key. So I've met a lot of teachers who will have a box of fidgets, and any of the kids can go up and help themselves if they want to. And that's really good because it's not singling out the ADHD kid. It's it's always got to be for everybody.
Yeah. There was some kid I read about a while ago who invented a reading ruler, where it was like a ruler, maybe like a wide, thick ruler. Sorry, not thick, but just wide. But it had a slit in the middle, and you were able to put the reading ruler over the thing that you were reading, and it would just let you only read one line, so that they would move the ruler as they were reading to help them focus on the line that they were reading, as opposed to getting distracted by the lines above or below or something like this.
Yeah, I'm dyslexic and ADHD, and that would have really helped me.
You think it would?
Yeah, 100%. ADHD is, so one thing ADHDers do when they're reading is, because their brain skips ahead.
Yep.
So especially now, if they're dyslexic and ADHD, so they're slower to read, to take in the information in the first place, their processing speed is slower, so the amount of time it's taking them to process the information, but their brain gets bored at that speed, so it wants to go ahead.
Yeah.
So you've got them trying to process the information whilst also trying to read the next line.
Yeah.
And so I can see how that ruler would be really helpful.
Yeah, well, the kid sold a heap.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
That was his little project that he did, and he sold a whole bunch of them, and now he's ordering them in bulk, and so that was an interesting one. Also, the other thing I saw recently was highlighting either the first and the last, or just the first letters in a word, like written on a page. If the word is a 5-letter word, like the first two or one letters at the front and the end, when you read it, you can actually read a whole lot quicker just by having those letters highlighted.
Yeah, there's and they've created actual fonts now for that, which do it automatically. Now, most ADHD, I actually did a little bit of a look into this, and most ADHDers that I found it really helpful. There was a few who found it hindered them.
Right.
But ADHD is a spectrum, right? So we're
we're
all slightly different. So nothing works for everybody. But it did work for a lot.
Yeah,
definitely.
Well, I found it amazing because it said, how quick can you read?
Yeah, I did
How
too.
quick can you read it? And I was like,
yeah.
I couldn't believe how quick I could read it. So that's amazing. And I'm a slow reader normally. Like when I'm reading a book, I'm really slow. So maybe that's the key.
Yeah, well, I'm dyslexic and ADHD, so I read extremely slow. So I tend to listen to audiobooks because reading a book takes too long, and I don't have the patience for that.
Yeah. And do you prefer, when you listen to audiobooks, do you prefer to be walking?
Driving. I listen to them in the car.
Yeah.
If I was to listen to an audiobook just sitting still, I'd either fall asleep or go out of my mind. I couldn't. My ADHD brain, it's not enough stimulation to keep me going.
I think I'm exactly the same. Yeah. And some of the best ideas I've ever had is when I'm out listening to a podcast and walking at the same time.
Same.
And then like the ideas flow, and I should be carrying something to write something down whenever that happens. Yeah. But driving as well. Yeah. I can absorb an entire book whilst driving the road at the same time or something. Like it's an interesting thing.
Yeah, I'm the same. And I think for a lot of ADHDers, we need extra stimulation. So just listening to an audiobook on its own, it's probably a little bit too, even if it's really interesting, it's probably a little bit too boring for a lot of us. But if you combine it with walking or driving or some other activity, it's just enough to allow us to be able to take it in and get the best from it.
And do you know the other one that it's just come to my mind then? Some people say, oh, you can listen to your audiobooks in double speed or 1.25 or something like that. And I can see the value in that, getting through it quicker, but I also have a lot of trouble with that.
Yeah, same.
And maybe that's making sense now because you've got to process.
You can't process it quick enough.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say, I actually have built up. So now I listen to all audiobooks at 1.25. But it took me a long time to get to that because I process information slower, because a lot of ADHDers do.
Yep.
So it can be, if you try and listen to it too quickly, you can't. And it's the same if I read a book. I can actually read a text out loud very quickly. But if you ask me at the end of it what it said, I have no idea what it was talking about because I was just reading word, not putting it together.
Yeah.
So yeah, sometimes our processing speed can be a little bit slower.
Yeah, right. And what about now? You're not a coffee drinker, I don't think. You're a tea
No,
drinker,
tea.
English lady. Do you ever get from a cup of tea? Do you ever get tea naps?
Tea naps? No, I don't know. I don't know what that is.
So there's a thing which is called coffee naps. Obviously, there's a lot more caffeine in a strong coffee, but where people have a coffee and they feel calm and tired after having it.
Yeah, that's an ADHD thing. So
Yeah.
it's the same. A lot of ADHDers, not all, I will say not all, but some ADHDers, when they first, if they first start medication, have the same thing, sends them to sleep. And it's because what it does, the stimulant in coffee, it's still stimulant.
Yep.
And that stimulant focuses their brain. Now their brain, naturally isn't focused. It's kind of darting around all over the place.
Yep.
So sometimes having that focus can bring them an enormous sense of calm,
Yep.
which is why they go really
Yeah.
quiet and sleepy.
So up until recently, I've never been able to work out why I could have a strong coffee and then have a nap.
Oh, now you know.
Feel like having a nap. Doesn't make any sense. Yeah, well, there you go. That might be the reasons. Hey, so you talked to some pretty big audiences.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah.
You were saying that you did a online thing to, what was 125,000 people?
Yes, yeah, last year. Yeah.
Which is only slightly bigger than the audience of this show, which is, I'd say that they've done pretty well. Tell me about that. Like, what was all that about?
Oh, well, I do a lot. So I do a lot of in-person presentations, a lot of online presentations, and this was one that was set up in America, and was sent out all over the world. So it was just an ADHD summit,
Yep.
A sort of global ADHD summit last year. Or was it the year before? It might have been the year before. Time all blurs into one because I'm ADHD and we don't understand time.
Yep.
And yes, that was the biggest. But because it was online, I didn't feel like I was speaking to 125,000 people because I couldn't see them. So it felt like I was speaking to one of the computer.
Or
and that was
9.
it. Yeah.
Could see 9 squares.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I've spoke to audiences from, 10 to 125,000. And actually, I have learned that for me, I would rather speak to 125,000 people or 5,000 in-person people than 10 any day. Because having 10 people up close and personal you really feel like you're sort of being, I don't know, it's weird. You feel like you're being judged more than when you've got 5,000 people in a room because you can't see their faces. They're just dots.
There's an intimate connection.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can understand that. And what do people want to know about these sort of things? I mean, that's a lot of people. What are they looking for?
All sorts. So it depends who it is. So parents are generally looking for strategies. They want to empower their kids. They want to make sure their kids are going to be okay and do anything they can to help. And so parents are usually looking for any information and advice to help that. Adult ADHDers themselves are usually looking for sometimes connection, sometimes someone who just gets it, how they do. Sometimes, again, they just want some simple strategies or to know that they're okay and there's nothing wrong with them. And then professionals, your teachers and therapists and psychologists, and they're usually looking for those strategies they can use to work with their clients.
Yeah. Okay. And so they're moving, I guess, from there into your conferences. Is that a similar?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Same. Yeah.
Yep. And what? Who comes to your conferences? The Australian ones.
So it's a mixed bag. So sort of 50% roughly is parents. So we get a huge proportion is parents. We do get a large chunk of adult ADHDers themselves who come along, and then the rest is made up of educators, and then things like OTs, psychs, doctors. Even speechies and things like that.
Yeah. And what sort of a reaction are you getting from, I guess, the parents is probably...
Oh, incredible. I've had the amount of parents who tell me every time that it's changed their life. I'll get parents come up to me in the street or at a conference or wherever and say they went to one of the conferences and it literally changed their life.
Yeah.
And it made them, just understand their child more or their family member or whoever it was. And one of the biggest things with the conferences is teaching parents that they don't have to listen to what the community says. They have to do what's right, do what's good for their child. And sometimes we spend so long with our friends and family saying, you need to do it like this, and you just need to give them a good smack. And they're just, that my child would never do that. I've heard that. A lot of ADHD parents have heard that. And it makes you doubt everything that you feel in your gut. And what we do is say, no, you listen to your gut.
Yeah.
Your kid's fine. Your kid's going to be okay. And you empower them and you do what you feel. Your kid's not naughty.
Yeah.
And
listening to your gut, is that something that you find easy when you have ADHD?
No. So ADHD is naturally really intuitive. Uh-huh. So we pick up on other people's feelings a lot better than a neurotypical person would, which means for a parent, in general situations, you've got a child who's ADHD, chances are their parent is as well, because it runs in families a lot.
Yeah, a really high percent.
Really high, 82%, so it's really high. And if you are that parent, your intuition's going to be really high, and you're going to know that when your child's struggling, they're struggling. They're not being naughty. They're not misbehaving. They're struggling. You know that. And then you have your friends and people telling you, no, you just need to discipline them more. You just need to do this. You need to do that. But your gut is telling you, I feel like they need support. I don't know what to do. I don't know whether I should be listening to my friend or my family member or going with my gut feeling. And so learning that actually your child is not being naughty. They just need some help.
Yeah, and there'd be a lot less naughty children, like in classrooms and whatnot, if they were getting the right help too, right?
Oh, 100%, 100%. Yeah. One of the biggest things that I talk about, which people struggle with, is the emotional dysregulation and anger and aggressive behaviours, which can be a real challenge for a lot of ADHDers. I was one of those. And, I am one of those. I still struggle with it. And so, you'll have parents, teachers who have this kid who gets really aggressive and angry, and that's how they cope with their anxiety. And they just think they're choosing that, and they're choosing to behave like that. And so therefore we need to discipline them more. But every time they discipline them, they're giving them the opposite of what they need. And if we were to stop doing that and start thinking, how can I support them? What are they struggling with? What do they need? Let's start building them up and building up their confidence and their self-esteem. And all of a sudden you'll see that anger and aggression starts to come down because their anxiety starts to come down because they feel better about themselves. So, everything that we're sort of traditionally expected to do, we're kind of doing the opposite of what we should do.
Yeah. And so for adults as well, like adults suffering similar sort of situations, I guess, and you talk about imposter syndrome in adults and stuff like that, self-doubt, that you are either skilled or qualified or whatever, but it still is a common thing, right? Like to have imposter syndrome as an adult with ADHD.
Yeah, and of course, you think of an ADHD as life. We're born into this world that doesn't suit us. It doesn't fit. And we're constantly told that we need to sit still, stop talking, do as we're told, stop doing this, stop doing that, and in amongst all that, we're living in a world where we see and we experience that constant stigma, as well as that feeling of being out of place our whole lives. Of course, at the end of it, we have self-esteem issues. It would be more shocking if we didn't. And with those self-esteem issues comes self-doubt. It comes that imposter syndrome. So when you think of the journey an adult with ADHD has been on their whole life, it stands to complete reason that they would doubt themselves.
Yeah. And which is funny, given what you were talking about before, where some of the most successful people in the world are ADHD.
Yeah, so the great thing about ADHD is yes, we have a whole bunch of challenges and we have a whole bunch of things that we struggle with, but we also have some really amazing qualities. We're extremely ambitious.
Yep.
We often like to win.
Yep.
We can get very passionate, and we have this thing called hyperfocus. So if something interests us, we'll focus really heavily on it. And if you take a person who is passionate, ambitious, and has hyperfocus on things that interest them, they're also really intuitive into what other people needs. You put that into a mixing pot, and what you have is the next leaders of the world, people who are going to create foundations that change the world and do amazing things. And this is why if we can nurture these kids with ADHD, we can see phenomenal things happen. They'll be more successful than anyone.
Yeah, of course. And talking about creating things, you've created something. Actually, you've created two somethings now as of just now, the peak centres. Do you want to tell us about that? What are your peak centres?
Yeah, so myself and a wonderful lady called Christina Keeble decided we both are neurodivergent, have neurodivergent children. And one of the things that we decided a few years ago was we wanted to set up a centre where instead of taking our children in for their therapies, so, we have OTs and speechies and things like that, when you go as a parent into one of those centres, it's all about fixing your child, making them better. And we hated that feeling. So we wanted to create somewhere where the kids go in and it's about celebrating who they are. We don't want to change you. You're perfect just the way you are. Yes, we can help you with the things you struggle with, but that doesn't mean we're going to change you. If I go to the doctor because I've got a cut, I want him to fix my cut. I don't want him to change who I am. Yeah. And this is the same thing. We can help someone with whatever they need help with without wanting to change them. They're perfect. I don't want to cure them of anything. They don't have a disease.
Yes.
They are just perfect as they are. And so when kids or adults, because we see adults as well, when they come into us, they want to come in. They don't want to leave because it's a place where they are completely respected and loved for exactly who they are as they are. And I don't care how many things they might struggle with. They're perfect.
Yeah.
And we're just going to help them so they feel better.
That's beautiful. And the language around it too, which is something that is now people are working on as well, which is good, is I am ADHD, not I have ADHD.
Yeah.
Something I've been pulled up on a few times, which I'm glad I have because, you can't take a pill and not have it anymore.
No. And it's harder with ADHD than it is with autism because autism is a word and you can say I am autistic and it's easier. Uh-huh. It's harder with ADHD because it's a stupid name and it doesn't make any sense and it has, it's a name that it's just two of its potential characteristics. It's really, really silly in that way. So it's harder to say I am ADHD. I tend to use the word I'm an ADHDer. I always say that a lot.
Yeah.
It doesn't really make sense.
Do you think it's going to get a rebrand?
I hope so.
Future? Yeah.
So I'm along with many experts around the world trying to campaign for it to be changed.
Yep.
The problem is a lot of people who are campaigning are just changing they're not seeing the real problem, which is that it's named after its characteristics.
Sure.
Now, those characteristics are wrong. I mean, I don't have an attention deficit. I just have, if anything, I have an overactive attention. It wants to be on all the things. So that's wrong. Many ADHDers don't have hyperactivity, so that's wrong. And I don't like the term disorder. But we can't replace it with other characteristics. ADHD has probably about 100 characteristics. So you can't sum it up with one or two of those. So it needs to be a word. Yep. And so my vote is for a word called animosus. I want it to be changed to animosus. Animosus in Latin means spirited. And I think if ever there was a word that summed up every ADHD I've ever met and was just, had a positive connotation, not a negative one, it would be animosus. So that's what I think it should be changed to.
Oh, there you go. That's very poetic.
Yes.
You'd write it on a T-shirt, wouldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm animosus.
Yes, I really like that word. So,
there you go. And where do you want it? Like, you've got a couple of peak centres, you've got your conferences. Is there anything else big that you want to do in the next, what's next?
It's all so the peak centres, we're just trying to grow as much as possible and as quick as possible so we can help more and more people. And the more peak centres that are out there, the more that we want that to become the norm. So other people creating therapy centres follow that pattern of multidisciplinary therapists who work together and have that neurodiversity affirming approach only. We really want to push that. The conferences will just keep building and building. And essentially my biggest goal for the next few years is just to help build that awareness, build that acceptance, and get rid of the stigma. The stigma is awful, and that just needs to go. Yeah,
and it's already come a way, because I know, like, just from my school years, the kid with ADD was always, it had stigma attached. I'm glad that's changing. I'm glad that more adults are realising in themselves when they're bringing up their kids, they see, that it's, potentially I have this as well. I'm glad that we're starting to say it's a brain type just like any brain type. It just needs the right environment. I appreciate that that's changing. I think it wasn't actually that long ago that because we say it's not actually ADHD being overdiagnosed, as you were saying before. It's just that we're becoming aware. But I remember thinking a while ago, it's a great time for autistic people because finally there's people working on making it acceptable and then understanding that they can be amazing in the right conditions. So, yeah, I think it's a positive time for ADHD, and I appreciate the work you're doing. And you're working with some of the biggest people as well, right? Like you've spoken with some of the biggest campaigners for ADHD.
Yeah, I'm very lucky. I work with a lot of amazing people, and I get to speak on stages with a lot of amazing people. And there are a lot of really, phenomenal people who are advocating for ADHD out there. There's still a long way to go, unfortunately. Yeah. There's still a lot of stigma. I read an article this morning in the UK. They've just done a big documentary in the UK on ADHD that was really really negative. A lot of incorrect information about ADHD. So there's so much. Every time we take 2 steps forward, there's 1 step back. But I think the more things like this that we do, the more conferences we have, the more ways that we can get that information out there, and eventually it will spread until it becomes okay. And hopefully we get to a point where that parent of the ADHD stops getting judged for being, you need to discipline them harder.
Yeah. Yeah. That must be a tough pill to swallow, having people tell you that, I think.
It's quite ridiculous because every ADHD parent that I know had tried that at some point. They tried to discipline them harder, and they found that the stricter they got, the more the child struggled. Yep. And the harder their challenges became. Yep. And it had the exact opposite effect. And only after a certain amount of time, the parents in most cases went, this isn't working, what do I do? Then they come and see someone like me, and I tell them, stop trying to discipline a condition out of your child. You can't. Yep. Let's take a whole different approach and start going in reverse and see if we can support them and start, instead of focusing on discipline, start focusing on bringing down their anxiety and bringing up their self-esteem, and let's see what difference that makes. And then all of a sudden they start to see, many of their ADHD characteristics just be more helped, and and their challenges sort of start to decrease a little bit.
Yeah. And maybe I've got an idea, I've just had one. You could create a TV show where you become like the super nanny.
That would be awesome because Super Nanny is horrific for ADHDers. What it does, so it's actually, so my husband and several people that I know were raised in very strict disciplinarian families. Now, the problem with that, which is all the Super Nanny stuff, sitting them on the naughty step and putting them in the corner facing the wall, things like that, that really just either doesn't work for an ADHD and they go off the charts with aggression and anger and things like that, or they become so scared that it works, but then it just creates trauma. So it only works superficially. It doesn't really actually help them with, of course, it doesn't help ADHD characteristics. It just makes them so scared that they force themselves to comply, and then they end up with really extreme trauma as an adult. And so Super Nanny is so harmful to ADHDers. So I would love to create a show that did what we need to actually do.
Yeah. So keep an eye. So you heard it here first. The Super Nanny version 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 is coming out very shortly, by September, I hear. So, Oh, you seem like the kind of person who's getting things done, so I'm confident. Hey, look, you've got what if people want to look up your conference, is the best place on myspiritedchild.com?
Yeah. So we have the Facebook page and Instagram and things like that. But yeah, just the website, myspiritedchild.com, and they get announced there. And, and we have a newsletter that they can subscribe to that's free as well, that's on there if they want to. Yep.
And what are your Insta handles and Facebook handles?
Facebook's just facebook.com/myspiritedchild. And Instagram is myspirited_child.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
The challenges of getting the name you want.
I had to have the underscore. Somebody had already took it. And I've got Rebecca L. Challoner is my own one, but that's just more that backstage images of me
Yeah.
and random things of my kids.
One of you with your computer in front of 125,000 people. Do we get to see?
I don't know if I did that one because you couldn't see anyone.
Yeah.
You just see a computer. But there's a lot of me on stage. I tend to take a lot of selfies on stage because I think it's always fun to get the audience up and
Yeah, I think that
taking
is fun.
selfies.
I think
So
that is, and they feel
I
like
do a
they're-
lot of those.
They're part of that.
Yeah, I've kind of done one. I've done those in every state, so I sort of compete them off against each other. Who can get
Oh.
the best selfie?
Okay, there you go. Going rock star status.
It's always just a bit of fun.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. myspiritedchild.com is where they can find your stuff. I should have come to the one in Melbourne when it was on in April. I think I saw a billboard for it
Yeah, there was a bit there.
on the way to Geelong.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw a billboard for it, and then our paths crossed. So, and I'm really glad I've met you. And thank you so much for sharing all that information because I think it's very relevant and current, and possibly could help a lot of people.
Hopefully,
So,
yeah.
Yeah. Rebecca Challoner, thank you for coming on the Good People podcast.
Thank you. You're welcome.
And if you would like to know more about the Good People podcast, head to iogn.com.au. Also, please like and subscribe. That helps us keep putting the show on. And we will catch you next time.
Well, it's a tip of the cap, it's a pat on the back, it's a smile from ear to ear. They're the good people from round